Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Hands Behind Augustus. You are not standing in a marble forum or watching a triumphal parade. Instead, imagine yourself in a narrow Roman office, the walls bare, the air heavy with dust and ink. Light slips in from a small window, falling across wooden tables crowded with wax tablets. Men sit quietly, styluses in hand, copying names, numbers, and decisions that will never bear their signatures. Outside, history remembers Augustus. Inside, history is being built by people whose names were rarely carved into stone. When Octavian, later called Augustus, emerged from decades of civil war as Rome's sole ruler, the empire was exhausted. Armies were scattered, provinces undertaxed or overtaxed, and records inconsistent or non-existent. Rome had conquered faster than it had learned how to manage. What made Augustus successful was not only his political skill or military restraint, but his ability to rely on thousands of ordinary workers who transformed chaos into routine. You rarely hear about them because they did not fight battles or give speeches. They counted grain shipments. They recorded land boundaries. They tracked veterans' pensions. They copied laws over and over again so the same rules applied in Gaul, Hispania, and Syria. These were scribes, freedmen, surveyors, messengers, and clerks, people whose work was boring enough to be trusted. Before Augustus, Rome had resisted bureaucracy. Republican Rome valued tradition and personal relationships over systems. Power came from reputation, not paperwork. But civil war had exposed the limits of that approach. Armies needed steady pay. Citizens needed predictable taxes. Provinces needed consistent administration. Augustus understood something subtle. Stability did not come from grand gestures, but from repetition. So he quietly expanded the administrative class. Many of these workers were freed slaves. Educated in elite households, they knew how to read, write, and calculate, skills surprisingly rare in the ancient world. Once freed, they could not hold elected office, but they could hold something more powerful, institutional memory. While senators came and went, clerks stayed. You can picture one of them, perhaps a man named Tiro, or someone like him, arriving early, unrolling yesterday's records, checking lists of names. Veterans eligible for land grants. Shipments of Egyptian grain, census data from a provincial town. Nothing about this work felt glorious, yet everything depended on it. Augustus ordered the first empire-wide census not for curiosity but for control. Counting people meant knowing who owed taxes, who could be conscripted, who qualified for benefits. Census workers traveled slowly, village to village, asking the same questions again and again. How many people live here? How much land do you farm? How many animals do you own? It was dull, repetitive, and often resented, but it worked. Over time, these numbers fed into ledgers in Rome. Ledgers fed into policy. Policy fed into peace. This was the Pax Romana, not the absence of violence, but the presence of administration. Surveyors were another invisible force. They walked fields with measuring rods, marking boundaries, resolving disputes before they turned violent. A clearly defined plot of land reduced lawsuits, feuds, and rebellion. Augustus invested heavily in land surveys because he understood that uncertainty breeds unrest. You don't hear poems about surveyors, but without them, land grants to veterans would have overlapped, taxes would have been disputed, and resentment would have simmered. Then there were the copyists. Every law Augustus issued had to exist in many places at once. Copies were made by hand, letter by letter. A single mistake could change meaning. Copyists learned to work slowly, carefully, faithfully. Their reward was anonymity. Some worked in Rome, others worked in provincial offices. All of them ensured that the emperor's will was not just proclaimed, but understood. Even the army depended on paperwork. Soldiers were paid according to contracts. Discharge papers determined citizenship rights. Equipment inventories prevented theft and shortages. Behind every legion stood clerks who never marched. Augustus famously claimed he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But marble requires supply chains, quarry records, transport logs, payment schedules. Every column rested on quiet calculations made months earlier. What is striking is how deliberately Augustus stayed out of the spotlight of this system. He allowed the Senate to believe it still mattered. He avoided calling himself king. Meanwhile, the real power flowed through offices filled with low-ranking workers who answered not to applause, but to procedure. These workers were not ideologues, they were practical. Their loyalty came from stability. Augustus paid them reliably. He promoted competence over lineage. For the first time, Rome began to resemble something modern, a state that functioned even when no one was watching. If you lived then, you might have noticed the change without understanding it. Taxes arrived on schedule. Roads were maintained. Grain distributions were predictable. The empire felt quieter not because nothing happened, but because fewer crises spiraled out of control. And yet this quiet had a cost. The more Rome relied on records, the more power flowed away from citizens and into systems. Decisions once debated publicly were now processed privately. Clerks did not vote, but their numbers decided outcomes. Over time, the empire learned to obey paperwork as much as people. Augustus knew this. He trusted the system he built more than the men who would follow him. That trust allowed Rome to survive weak emperors, short reigns, and distant wars. But it also meant that the empire's fate rested in rooms no historian would later describe in detail. As you sit with this thought, consider how easily history forgets those rooms. When order becomes normal, no one asks how it arrived. When peace lasts long enough, its architects fade into the background. And that raises a quiet, unsettling question. If Augustus depended so deeply on these unseen workers, what happened to Rome when the systems outgrew the people who once carefully maintained them? If you stayed in Rome long enough, you would notice that emperors came and went, but the offices rarely changed. The same doors opened each morning. The same benches filled. The same hands reached for the same tools. Augustus understood something that few rulers before him had grasped so clearly. Power that lasts must be boring enough to ignore. The clerks and administrators who served under Augustus did not retire when a campaign ended or a law was passed. Their work had no finish line. It repeated every day, shaped by habit rather than inspiration. That repetition was the point. Most of these workers lived modestly. They wore plain tunics, lived in crowded apartments, and walked the same streets each day. Their status was low enough that senators ignored them, but high enough that ordinary citizens treated them with cautious respect. A man who controlled records controlled outcomes. If your name was spelled incorrectly on a list, your land grant might disappear. If your tax payment was recorded late, penalties followed. These workers learned quickly that precision mattered more than loyalty. Augustus rewarded accuracy, not flattery. A clerk who quietly corrected errors could expect stability. One who caused confusion, even unintentionally, might vanish from records altogether. The imperial household became the center of this administrative world. Unlike republican magistrates, Augustus ran much of the empire from his personal staff. This blurred the line between public service and private employment. Freedmen such as Maecenas and Agrippa became managers rather than politicians, overseeing networks of workers who answered upward, not outward. You can imagine the daily rhythm. A messenger arrives from Hispania with reports on harvest yields. A clerk logs the figures, compares them to previous years, flags a discrepancy. Another clerk cross-checks census data. A third prepares a summary for a superior who may or may not ever meet the emperor himself. Decisions moved slowly, deliberately. Augustus preferred delays to mistakes. If uncertainty arose, workers were instructed to wait, remeasure, recount, or recopy. Speed was less important than consistency. This patience, applied across decades, did more to stabilize Rome than any victory parade. One of the most significant but least dramatic changes was the standardization of time. Administrative schedules required predictable days for tax collection, legal hearings, and distributions. Calendars were synchronized. Religious festivals were fixed. The result was a shared rhythm that stretched across the empire. You woke, worked, and rested on the same schedule as millions of others. That shared rhythm depended on people who never appeared in history books. Augustus also expanded archives. Before his reign, records were scattered, personal, and vulnerable. Now, copies were stored in multiple locations. Fires, floods, or sabotage could not erase everything. Archivists guarded shelves of tablets and scrolls that recorded births, deaths, contracts, and decrees. They worked quietly, knowing that their success would be measured by how little anyone noticed them. This system had an unexpected effect. It outlived Augustus himself. When he died, Rome did not collapse. Tiberius stepped into a structure already functioning. Taxes continued. Grain shipments arrived. Courts operated. The empire mourned, but it did not panic. That calm response was not emotional, it was procedural. The workers who kept the empire running did not swear allegiance to a man. They served continuity. Yet this continuity came with tension. As records became more important, people began to fear them. Mistakes became harder to escape. Once written down, a decision followed you. A debt recorded was a debt remembered. Appeals became rarer, not because justice improved, but because procedure hardened. Clerks were instructed not to interpret, only to record. That neutrality protected them and the system from emotional involvement. But it also meant suffering could be processed without empathy. Grain shortages were logged as numbers. Population losses were summarized as statistics. Augustus likely saw this as a feature, not a flaw. Empires cannot afford to feel everything they cause. Over time, workers developed informal practices to soften the system. A delayed entry here, a generous interpretation there. These small acts of discretion kept resentment manageable. They were unofficial, undocumented, and essential. And still, these workers remained invisible. When poets praised Augustus, they spoke of peace and prosperity, not of ledgers balanced at midnight. When monuments were built, they honored generals and gods, not archivists. Even historians, writing generations later, focused on emperors because emperors left speeches and scandals behind. Clerks left silence. But silence is powerful. It hides labor so effectively that later generations mistake stability for inevitability. Rome did not become orderly because Romans were naturally disciplined. It became orderly because thousands of people spent their lives doing the same small tasks correctly. You might wonder whether these workers understood their importance. Most likely they did not. Their world was immediate: today's list, today's report, today's copy. They measured success by survival and routine. Ambition was dangerous. Visibility invited scrutiny. Augustus encouraged this mindset. He did not want brilliant administrators. He wanted dependable ones. And so the empire rested on people who never expected statues, never gave speeches, and never imagined their work would shape centuries. Their reward was predictability. Their legacy was endurance. But as the system grew larger and more complex, a question quietly emerged, one no one dared ask aloud. What happens when the system becomes more important than the people maintaining it? By the end of Augustus's reign, Rome was no longer held together by shared memory or tradition, but by procedures that assumed cooperation. The empire functioned because workers followed rules they did not create, serving rulers they might never see. This worked until it didn't. And that leads to a deeper uncertainty, one that would not fully reveal itself until long after Augustus was gone. Could a system built on quiet obedience survive when those at the top no longer respected the invisible labor beneath them? When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome paused, but only briefly. There were ceremonies, public mourning, and carefully staged displays of continuity. The emperor was gone, yet the empire woke up the next morning and continued to function. Taxes were collected. Courts convened. Grain ships arrived on schedule. To most people living in the provinces, nothing felt dramatically different. That was not an accident. It was the final proof that Augustus's quiet workers had succeeded. You might expect chaos after the death of a ruler who had reshaped the state. Instead, what followed was administrative inertia. The machinery built over decades continued to move forward, guided by habits rather than charisma. This was the ultimate achievement of the invisible class. They had made leadership almost optional. Tiberius inherited not only power, but a system that limited his freedom. He could not easily change tax structures, alter land records, or dismantle offices without destabilizing everything. The empire had become self-reinforcing. Clerks followed precedent. Archivists protected continuity. Surveyors remeasured land using the same methods their predecessors had used. In a sense, Augustus had designed Rome to survive mediocre rulers. He did this not through laws alone, but through culture, teaching workers that their loyalty was to procedure, not personality. This culture endured for generations. Provincial governors came and went, often corrupt or incompetent, yet Rome still functioned because local administrators understood what was expected of them. They knew the forms. They knew the schedules. They knew how to report problems upward in language that minimized alarm. Even rebellions were processed bureaucratically. Losses were recorded. Repairs were ordered. Punishments were scheduled. The system absorbed shocks and continued. But endurance carries a hidden cost. As decades passed, the quiet workers became increasingly detached from the outcomes of their labor. Decisions were justified by precedent rather than context. A tax was collected because it had always been collected. A census category remained because no one remembered why it existed. The system no longer asked whether a rule made sense, only whether it had been followed. This rigidity would later haunt the empire. Still, for a long time, it worked well enough. Rome expanded. Trade flourished. Roads were maintained. People lived predictable lives within predictable limits. The empire felt eternal because it behaved like something that did not need to think about itself. Yet none of this would have been possible without the uncelebrated discipline of ordinary people. Consider the final years of Augustus's life. He withdrew from public appearances, increasingly ill, increasingly distant, but the offices remained staffed. Reports continued to arrive. Workers adjusted quietly to reduced imperial involvement. They did not wait for instructions. They followed routines that had become second nature. When Augustus reportedly asked whether he had played his role well, it was a theatrical question. The real answer lay elsewhere, in the offices he would never see again, in the ledgers that bore no signatures, in the hands that would continue writing long after his death. History often credits leaders for stability, but stability is not an act. It is a habit. Habits are formed by repetition, and repetition requires people willing to remain unnoticed. The Roman Empire would eventually fall, but not because its workers failed. If anything, they succeeded too well. The system became so normalized that it lost flexibility. When pressures mounted, economic strain, invasions, political decay, the bureaucracy could record the decline in exquisite detail, but it struggled to adapt. Even then, the workers endured. Long after emperors lost real power, local clerks continued to collect taxes. Long after legions vanished, administrators still issued orders. The empire faded unevenly, not collapsing so much as dissolving into routines that no longer had a center. And this is perhaps the strangest legacy of Augustus's quiet workers. They taught the world how to function without spectacle. Medieval kingdoms inherited Roman administrative habits. Modern states inherited them in turn. Censuses, archives, standardized measurements, scheduled taxation, these are not inventions of great men, but accumulations of boring solutions to recurring problems. You live with their legacy now. Every form you fill out, every number assigned to you, every system that works without explanation is a descendant of those Roman offices. You may never think about the people who maintain them. That is the point. As you drift back from ancient Rome, it becomes clear that history's loudest figures often stand on foundations they barely acknowledge. Leaders are remembered because they are visible. Workers are forgotten because they succeed. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this: the quieter the labor, the more powerful its impact tends to be. Rome did not last because Augustus was brilliant. It lasted because thousands of ordinary people showed up every day, wrote things down carefully, and trusted that doing so mattered even when no one was watching. That pattern repeats again and again throughout history. And it leaves you with a final, lingering thought as this story closes. How many other empires, revolutions, and transformations were shaped not by speeches or battles, but by people whose names were never meant to be remembered? Story 2. The Anonymous Monks of Charlemagne's Empire. If you step into Europe around the year 800, the first thing you notice is how fragile everything feels. Roads that once connected cities are broken or overgrown. Towns are smaller, quieter, often clustered around walls or rivers. Literacy is rare. Books are rarer still. Knowledge, once spread across an empire, now survives in fragments, half-remembered prayers, damaged manuscripts, and fading traditions. Charlemagne stands at the center of this moment in history. He is remembered as a unifier, a conqueror, a ruler crowned emperor by the Pope himself. His name appears in chronicles, laws, and legends, but the survival of his empire and much of European knowledge did not depend on his crown or his armies. It depended on monks who rarely left their rooms. You would find them in monasteries scattered across forests, valleys, and former Roman towns. These places were not designed for grandeur. They were practical, enclosed, repetitive. Stone walls kept out weather and noise. Bells structured the day. Silence was enforced not as punishment but as a working condition. Inside, men sat at wooden desks in rooms called scriptoria. Light came from narrow windows. Ink froze in winter. Fingers cramped. Eyes strained. The work was slow, uncomfortable, and endless. They copied texts. Not once but repeatedly. Not creatively but faithfully. Line by line, word by word. Most of the monks doing this work were anonymous even in their own time. They did not sign their names. Their handwriting might be recognizable to a trained eye, but their identities dissolved into the pages they produced. Their goal was not originality, but preservation. Charlemagne understood the danger Europe faced. Without written law, governance weakened. Without religious texts, authority fragmented. Without shared language and learning, unity was impossible. His solution was not only military conquest but cultural repair. He ordered a revival of learning, what historians later called the Carolingian Renaissance. But a revival requires labor, and Charlemagne himself could barely write. He depended entirely on others to carry out this vision. Monasteries became the backbone of this effort. Monks were trained to read Latin accurately. This alone was revolutionary. Over generations, spoken Latin had fractured into regional dialects. Texts copied carelessly became corrupted. Meaning drifted. Laws lost clarity. Theology fractured. The monks slowed everything down. They standardized spelling. They corrected grammar. They compared older copies against newer ones. When they encountered contradictions, they debated quietly, often leaving notes in the margins that later generations would rediscover. You can imagine a monk pausing over a single word, unsure whether the faded letter is an E or an O. The difference might change a sentence, a doctrine, or a legal instruction. He hesitates. He checks another manuscript. He decides. That decision echoes forward for centuries. This work required patience that bordered on devotion. Days were structured around prayer and labor. Copying was not a hobby, it was obedience. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized stability, humility, and repetition, perfect traits for people tasked with saving knowledge without reshaping it. The irony is quiet and deep. Europe's intellectual survival depended on men who withdrew from the world. These monks did not travel widely. Many never left their monastery after taking vows, yet their influence traveled further than armies. A single manuscript copied in Northumbria might end up in Italy generations later. A text preserved in a remote abbey could become the foundation of medieval education. Charlemagne encouraged this without micromanaging it. He appointed scholars like Alcuin of York to oversee educational reforms, but the real work happened far from court, in cold rooms, in silence, under rules that discouraged pride. Monks copied not only religious texts, but works of Roman law, philosophy, medicine, and poetry. Many of the classical works known today survived only because a monk decided they were worth copying even if he did not fully understand them. This was not inevitable. Some texts were ignored, others were lost forever. Preservation depended on time, materials, and interest. A shortage of parchment could mean choosing which books survived and which didn't. These choices were practical, not ideological. Space mattered. Resources mattered. Again and again, survival came down to boring decisions. The monks also developed new tools to make their work more efficient. One of the most important was Carolingian minuscule, a clear, standardized script designed for readability. It used spaces between words, consistent letter forms, and punctuation that made texts easier to understand. This script spread across Europe, replacing messy regional styles. It reduced errors. It made copying faster. It shaped how Europe read for centuries. You benefit from this today more than you realize. Modern lowercase letters descend directly from these monks' handwriting. Yet no one celebrated them for it. Charlemagne received praise for restoring order. Bishops gained prestige. Scholars gained reputation. The monks returned to their desks. Their lives were monotonous by design. Wake, pray, work, eat, pray, sleep, repeat, year after year. Some monks doubted the value of what they did. Others accepted it as service. Very few imagined that future generations would care. Their worldview did not center on legacy. It centered on discipline. And still, something remarkable happened. Because of them, Europe retained a shared intellectual foundation. When Charlemagne's empire fractured after his death, as all empires eventually do, the knowledge preserved in monasteries did not disappear. It waited. Kings rose and fell, borders shifted, languages evolved, but the books remained. Monasteries became islands of continuity in a sea of change. When later rulers sought legitimacy, they turned to texts preserved by monks. When universities emerged centuries later, they relied on manuscripts copied by men long forgotten. The monks did not unify Europe politically. They unified it quietly, culturally. Yet there is a tension here that history often glosses over. Preservation is not neutrality. By choosing what to copy, monks shaped what survived. Their values influenced the future even as they tried to remain invisible. And that raises a question worth sitting with as this first section comes to rest. If Europe's memory survived because a few quiet men chose what to preserve, what knowledge disappeared simply because no one had the time, space, or patience to copy it? If you remained in those monasteries long enough, the silence would begin to feel heavy rather than peaceful. The work was not only repetitive, it was selective. Every shelf had limits. Every hide prepared for parchment came from an animal that had to be raised, slaughtered, cleaned, and scraped. Ink required minerals, soot, patience. Time itself was rationed between prayer and labor. This meant that monks could not preserve everything. And so quietly, without debate or decree, they made decisions that shaped Europe's memory. A monk copying a text rarely thought in terms of historical importance. He thought in terms of usefulness, clarity, and alignment with doctrine. Texts that supported Christian teaching were prioritized. Texts that conflicted with it were sometimes copied with caution or not at all. Others were set aside simply because they were difficult, damaged, or written in poor Latin. No one announced these choices. They happened slowly, through neglect as much as intent. You might imagine a monk opening a brittle Roman manuscript on astronomy. The diagrams are confusing. The Latin is archaic. He squints, uncertain. Meanwhile, a clean copy of a church father's commentary waits beside him. The decision makes itself. This is how loss happens, not through destruction, but through inconvenience. Yet these monks were not vandals. Many preserved texts whose content they did not fully agree with. Aristotle survived in fragments. Cicero survived in pieces. Medical texts were copied because they were useful, even if their philosophy felt foreign. Preservation was pragmatic before it was ideological. Still, the process filtered knowledge. Charlemagne's reforms intensified this filtering. He wanted uniformity, one correct Latin, one standardized liturgy, one shared intellectual base. Monks were trained to correct errors in older texts. This meant smoothing inconsistencies, harmonizing contradictions, and sometimes altering phrasing to match accepted doctrine. They did this carefully, often sincerely believing they were restoring originals. But even restoration is interpretation. You can see it in marginal notes, tiny, cramped comments squeezed between lines. This seems incorrect. Other copies differ. Consult elder brother. These notes reveal uncertainty, debate, and human judgment at work beneath the surface of supposedly fixed texts. The monks themselves lived under constant correction. Abbots reviewed work. Mistakes were pointed out. Discipline was enforced. Accuracy became moral. This created a culture where error was feared more than loss. It was better to omit than to copy incorrectly. That instinct shaped the survival of knowledge as much as any external threat. Meanwhile, Charlemagne's empire expanded and contracted. Borders shifted. Viking raids threatened monasteries, forcing monks to flee with what they could carry. In these moments, decisions became even more stark. Which books to save, which to abandon. They chose what they knew mattered. Often that meant scripture and law, but sometimes a monk slipped a poem or a medical treatise into a bundle. Those quiet acts of personal judgment saved works that later generations would call classics. The monks did not see themselves as guardians of Western civilization. They saw themselves as caretakers of order in a fragile world. Their priorities reflected that. And yet the effect was enormous. By standardizing texts, they created a shared intellectual language. Scholars in different regions could finally read the same words in the same way. Education became possible again. Administration became coherent. Law could be taught rather than memorized imperfectly. This supported rulers long after Charlemagne's empire fractured. Kings relied on literate clergy trained in monastic settings. Charters, treaties, and laws all depended on people shaped by this quiet labor. Still, the monks remained invisible. They rarely wrote about themselves. Their chronicles focused on kings, miracles, and disasters, not daily labor. When a manuscript included a colophon, a note at the end, it might say only, "Pray for the scribe." That was enough. Over time, monasteries became more than preservation centers. They were training grounds. Young boys learned to read and write there, absorbing not only knowledge, but habits of discipline and routine. These habits spread outward as monks became advisors, teachers, and administrators. Thus, a silent workforce shaped medieval governance. But the system had limits. It was slow. It was conservative. Innovation was rare and cautious. New ideas had to fit within existing frameworks or wait generations for acceptance. The monks preserved the past so well that the future struggled to emerge. This tension would define Europe for centuries: stability versus creativity, preservation versus progress. Yet without preservation, there would have been nothing to build upon. As Charlemagne's legacy faded into legend, the monks continued. They did not mourn the empire's fragmentation. Their work did not depend on political unity. They copied texts for a future they could not imagine. And so, you are left with a quiet paradox. The people most responsible for Europe's intellectual survival were the least interested in shaping it. Which brings you to an unresolved thought, one that lingers as this section ends. When knowledge survives only through selective preservation, is what we inherit a reflection of the past or of the quiet preferences of those who chose what to save? By the time Charlemagne's empire finally fractured into smaller kingdoms, very little noise accompanied its intellectual survival. There were no declarations, no celebrations, no awareness that something essential had been secured. The monks continued their routines as they always had, rising before dawn, praying at fixed hours, copying texts by fading light, unaware that they had already outlasted an empire. From their perspective, nothing dramatic had occurred. And that is precisely why their work endured. As political authority weakened and borders hardened, monasteries remained strangely stable. Their rules did not depend on kings. Their rhythms were older than empires and flexible enough to survive them. When one ruler fell, another rose, but the bells still rang at the same hours. Ink was still mixed. Parchment was still prepared. Words were still copied. In a world defined by instability, the monasteries offered predictability. This predictability allowed knowledge to wait. For centuries, much of what the monks preserved lay dormant. Texts were read, recited, and studied, but not widely applied. Roman law survived long before it returned to courts. Classical philosophy endured long before it reshaped universities. Scientific observations waited quietly, their usefulness unrecognized. The monks did not revive Europe in a dramatic sense. They postponed its forgetting. And postponement, as it turns out, can be more powerful than invention. When new institutions finally emerged, cathedral schools, then universities, they drew almost entirely on monastic libraries. Professors taught from texts copied hundreds of years earlier. Students learned from words preserved by men who never imagined such classrooms. Even the Renaissance, so often described as a rebirth, was less a discovery than an unsealing. What re-emerged had never truly vanished. It had been stored, repaired, and quietly protected. The monks received little credit for this. By the time scholars celebrated classical learning, the scribes who preserved it were long dead and unnamed. Their labor had been absorbed into the background of history, mistaken for inevitability. Yet the influence of their discipline remained. The very idea that texts should be copied accurately, standardized, and preserved systematically came from monastic practice. The habits of footnotes, marginal commentary, and careful comparison all emerged from these scriptoria. Modern scholarship traces its methods back to monks who worked not to innovate, but to avoid error. There is something deeply unsettling in this. Civilization often congratulates itself on progress, yet its survival depends on people who resist change long enough for it to become safe. The monks were conservative by necessity. Their caution slowed transformation, but it also prevented collapse. They taught Europe how to wait. Even their anonymity was part of the system. Without individual recognition, the work became transferable. One monk died, another took his place. The task mattered more than the person. This was resilience through interchangeability, quiet, effective, and emotionally distant. In modern terms, it resembles infrastructure more than heroism. Roads do not demand praise. Archives do not seek recognition. They exist so that others can act. As centuries passed, monasteries themselves changed. Some grew wealthy, others declined. Some became centers of reform, others stagnated. But the core contribution, the preservation of memory, had already been made. What remains striking is how close Europe came to losing it all. Had even a few generations of monks chosen differently, copied less carefully, valued preservation less, or abandoned their routines under pressure, the intellectual inheritance of an entire continent would have been thinner, narrower, perhaps unrecognizable. This fragility is easy to miss because the outcome feels solid now. You live in a world where texts are abundant, copied instantly, stored endlessly. It is difficult to imagine knowledge balanced so delicately on the patience of a few individuals. But that was the reality of early medieval Europe. Memory survived not because it was powerful, but because it was quietly protected. Charlemagne is remembered as a father of Europe, but his empire dissolved quickly. The monks who served under his reign shaped something far more durable. They created continuity without control, influence without visibility. They did not lead, they endured. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson they left behind. That civilization is not only built by those who move history forward, but by those who prevent it from slipping backward when no one else is paying attention. As this story closes, you are left with a final reflection, one that stretches beyond monasteries and manuscripts. If so much of what defines your world survived because of people who chose patience over recognition, how much of history's future is already being quietly decided by ordinary workers whose names will never be remembered? Story 3. Qin Shi Huang's Unnamed Engineers. If you stand at the beginning of China's first empire, you do not hear speeches. You hear shovels. You hear the scrape of wood against earth, the dull thud of stone being set into place, the steady rhythm of labor repeated thousands of times a day. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, is remembered for his ambition for unifying China, for building walls, roads, and monuments, for ruling with iron certainty. But his vision did not move on its own. It moved because countless unnamed engineers, foremen, surveyors, and laborers translated orders into measurements. Before unification, China was divided into competing states, each with its own systems of weights, measures, coins, scripts, and road standards. Crossing a border meant relearning how to trade, how to count, how to obey. The first emperor's most enduring achievement was not conquest alone, but standardization. And standardization is not an idea, it is a process. You can imagine an engineer standing beside a newly marked road, holding a measuring cord. The cord must be the right length. The width must be exact. If the road is too narrow, carts jam. Too wide, and resources are wasted. Multiply this decision across thousands of miles, and the empire either functions or doesn't. The emperor issued decrees. Engineers made them real. These workers came from many backgrounds. Some were trained specialists, educated in mathematics and construction. Others were conscripted laborers learning on the job. Many were prisoners. All were bound by the same demand: accuracy. The Qin state believed order came from uniformity. To enforce it, they standardized axle widths so carts could travel on the same ruts. They standardized weights so grain could be taxed fairly. They standardized written characters so laws could be read the same way everywhere. Each standard required implementation. That meant molds cast for weights, measuring rods distributed, scripts carved into stone for reference. Engineers traveled from region to region, correcting local practices, sometimes violently. A measured unit was not a small error, it was a threat to unity. The most famous project associated with Qin Shi Huang is the Great Wall, though what he built was a network of walls, not the continuous structure imagined today. These walls were assembled quickly, often using rammed earth, a technique that required careful layering and compression. Rammed earth sounds simple, it is not. Too dry and it crumbles, too wet and it collapses. The mixture must be just right, the pressure consistent. This knowledge lived in the hands of workers, not in imperial proclamations. Engineers supervised, adjusted, corrected. They learned which soils held best, which slopes needed reinforcement, which foundations would fail. Their reward was survival. Most were never named. Records focused on outcomes, not process. Walls existed, roads connected, canals flowed. The human cost was immense. Thousands died from exhaustion, exposure, or punishment. Yet the system absorbed these losses as part of construction, not tragedy. Qin governance treated labor as a resource. Engineers managed that resource as carefully as stone or timber. They tracked quotas, organized shifts, and reported progress. A delayed project invited punishment. A collapsed wall could mean death. This pressure shaped their work. Precision became self-preservation. Beyond walls, the empire needed internal connectivity. Roads radiated from the capital like spokes. Canals redirected rivers. These projects required surveying land at scale. Elevation, slope, and water flow had to be calculated without modern instruments. Surveyors used simple tools, plumb lines, sighting poles, water levels. Their effectiveness came from repetition and shared method. A standardized empire required standardized technique. And here is the quiet truth. The emperor could command uniformity, but only engineers could teach it. Once a method worked, it spread. Foremen trained others. Practices were copied. Over time, consistency emerged not because everyone agreed, but because everyone followed the same instructions. This system extended into administration. Standardized scripts meant clerks could read orders issued hundreds of miles away, but someone had to teach that script. Someone had to carve reference models. Someone had to correct deviations. Again, quiet labor. The first emperor famously ordered the burning of books and burial of scholars. This act looms large in history, but it obscures another reality. The empire depended on technical knowledge preserved outside philosophy. Engineering manuals, construction techniques, and measurement standards continued, transmitted through practice rather than text. Knowledge survived in motion. You might picture an older foreman correcting a younger worker's grip on a tamping tool. No record remains of this lesson, yet it ensured a wall segment would stand for decades. Multiply that lesson by thousands, and an empire takes shape. The Qin system was harsh, but it was effective. Roads allowed armies to move quickly. Walls channeled invasions. Standardization reduced friction. For a brief time, China functioned as a single, measurable entity. But this efficiency masked strain. Engineers were under constant pressure to deliver impossible timelines. Labor shortages were met with conscription. Failures were punished collectively. There was little room for adaptation or dissent. When conditions changed, floods, droughts, soil failures, the system demanded results anyway. The empire appeared strong because it was tightly controlled, but control requires maintenance. As you sit with this image of an empire measured into existence by people whose names were never recorded, a question begins to form. If Qin Shi Huang's power depended so completely on engineers translating vision into reality, what happened when the weight of that vision exceeded what careful measurement could support? That question lingers at the edge of the story, waiting for the next section to unfold. If you stayed with the engineers of the Qin Empire long enough, you would begin to feel the pressure they lived under, not the dramatic pressure of rebellion or battle, but the slow, constant weight of expectations that could never be relaxed. The empire demanded perfection, and perfection had to be produced on schedules that ignored weather, geography, and human limits. For the Qin state, engineering was not a profession, it was enforcement. Projects were assigned with deadlines that assumed obedience from land, water, and people alike. A canal was expected to flow because the decree said it should. A road was expected to reach its destination because the map required it. When reality resisted, It was not the plan that was questioned, but the workers. Engineers stood between imperial command and physical reality. They translated abstract authority into stone, earth, and wood. When that translation failed, they absorbed the consequences. You can imagine a foreman overseeing a canal excavation. The soil collapses repeatedly. Workers complain of flooding. Tools break. The timeline slips. Reports must be sent upward, written carefully. Too much honesty risks punishment. Too much optimism risks failure later. So reports became cautious documents, shaped to satisfy superiors while buying time on the ground. Progress was emphasized. Difficulties were minimized. Engineers learned to write in ways that protected themselves. This habit would echo throughout Chinese administrative culture for centuries. Despite the pressure, innovation occurred but quietly. Engineers adapted techniques to local conditions. They altered wall construction depending on soil type. They adjusted canal gradients to reduce erosion. These adjustments were not officially acknowledged. They were simply done. Standardization in practice allowed variation only where absolutely necessary. This balance between rigid standards and flexible execution was fragile. It depended on experienced engineers who knew when to follow rules and when to bend them. As long as such people remained in place, the system held. But the Qin Empire moved fast, too fast. The emperor's obsession with uniformity extended to labor itself. Massive conscription pulled farmers away from fields, reducing food production. Engineers were expected to manage not only construction, but morale, health, and logistics, all without formal authority. They organized food deliveries. They rotated workers when possible. They quietly slowed work to prevent collapse, even when that meant risking punishment. Survival required constant negotiation with an inflexible system. And still, the empire expanded its demands. The construction of the emperor's mausoleum, guarded by what we now call the Terracotta Army, was one of the most complex projects of the ancient world. It required coordinated production of thousands of unique figures, weapons, and architectural elements. This was mass production before factories. Engineers organized workshops. Artisans followed standardized proportions while allowing variation. Kilns were calibrated. Weapons were stamped with maker marks not for pride but for accountability. If a weapon failed inspection, responsibility could be traced. The system worked because engineers managed it. But this success masked exhaustion. The empire's infrastructure grew faster than its ability to sustain it. Roads and canals required maintenance. Walls eroded. Workers aged or died. Replacements lacked experience. The system had been built quickly, not deeply. When Qin Shi Huang died, the administrative machine continued briefly, much like Rome after Augustus. Engineers kept working. Projects continued. Orders were followed. But unlike Rome, Qin lacked a culture of administrative patience. Fear had replaced trust. Punishment had replaced continuity. Engineers who had once quietly adapted now faced harsher oversight. Innovation became riskier. Reporting problems became dangerous. The system lost its ability to adjust. Rebellions broke out not because roads failed or walls collapsed, but because the human systems beneath them did. Overworked populations rebelled. Supply chains faltered. Engineers could measure stone, but they could not measure resentment. Within a few years, the empire collapsed. History remembers this collapse as inevitable, blaming tyranny or ambition. But beneath those labels lies a quieter truth. The engineering system that built the empire had been pushed beyond its capacity to maintain it. The unnamed engineers did not fail, they were consumed. Yet their work did not disappear. Later dynasties inherited Qin standards. Measurements persisted. Road layouts influenced future routes. Administrative habits survived. The tools and techniques developed under pressure became the foundation of a more sustainable system under the Han Dynasty. The Qin Empire died young, but its methods lived on. And this is the quiet paradox of Qin Shi Huang's legacy. His empire collapsed quickly, yet its infrastructure shaped China for millennia. This endurance did not come from ideology or conquest, but from practical systems created by people who were never allowed to rest. As you step back from this story, another unresolved thought begins to form. If the engineers succeeded so completely that their work outlived the empire that consumed them, where is the line between building something eternal and being destroyed by the act of building it? That question remains unanswered, waiting in the final section. When the Qin Empire collapsed only a few years after the death of its founder, the fall felt sudden and dramatic in political histories. Rebellions flared, palaces burned, officials fled or were executed. Yet across the land, much of what the engineers had built remained stubbornly in place. Roads still followed their measured lines. Walls still traced ridges and valleys. Canals still guided water where it had been forced to flow. The empire vanished, but the measurements did not. For the engineers who survived long enough to witness the transition, this must have been disorienting. The authority that had demanded their precision no longer existed, but the precision itself still shaped daily life. Farmers used roads built under compulsion. Merchants relied on standardized weights created under threat. Local officials continued to enforce practices they no longer fully understood. This is the quiet aftershock of infrastructure. It persists even when belief collapses. The Han Dynasty, which replaced the Qin, condemned much of Qin Shi Huang's brutality. They criticized his excesses, softened punishments, and emphasized moral governance. Yet they kept the systems that worked. Measurements were retained. Administrative divisions were preserved. Engineering techniques were refined rather than rejected. The Han did something subtle and important. They separated the tools from the terror. Where the Qin had ruled through fear and urgency, the Han ruled through endurance. Engineers were still essential, but they were given space to adapt. Projects were extended over longer timelines. Maintenance became as important as construction. This shift allowed the same technical foundations to produce a more stable empire. The Great Wall segments built under the Qin were repaired, extended, and repurposed. Roads were maintained rather than endlessly expanded. Canals were dredged instead of constantly redirected. The work became cyclical rather than frantic. This change revealed something the Qin had ignored. Engineering systems need care, not just creation. And still, the names of the engineers vanished. The Han historians recorded emperors, reforms, and wars. Engineers appeared only as numbers, so many workers mobilized, so many Li lost in construction. Individual skill disappeared into collective output. The culture of anonymity continued. Yet that anonymity did not mean insignificance. Chinese statecraft increasingly relied on technical expertise. Surveying, hydraulics, and logistics became core administrative skills. Manuals circulated, apprenticeships formed, knowledge stabilized. This lineage traces directly back to the unnamed workers of the Qin. Their legacy is not a single monument, but a way of building states through standardization, measurement, and repeatable process. This approach influenced Chinese governance long after dynasties rose and fell. You can still see echoes of it today in the emphasis on infrastructure, in the respect for technical competence, in the belief that order begins with uniform systems. And yet the cost remains embedded in the story. The Qin engineers succeeded at making the emperor's vision real, but the speed and severity of that vision destroyed the human capacity required to sustain it. They were asked to build permanence under conditions that allowed none for themselves. This imbalance is the quiet warning left behind by their work. Civilizations often celebrate builders while ignoring the strain placed on building. Roads and walls appear solid, timeless, inevitable. But beneath them lies a history of exhaustion, adaptation, and unrecorded judgment. The unnamed engineers did not leave memoirs. They left measurements. Those measurements shaped how people moved, traded, and governed long after the empire that demanded them disappeared. The engineers became invisible not because they failed, but because they succeeded too completely. Their work blended into the landscape. As you let this story settle, it invites a final reflection. When we look at ancient achievements and marvel at their scale, how often do we mistake endurance for intention and forget the ordinary people whose careful, pressured decisions made endurance possible at all? Story 4. The Silent Quartermasters of Alexander the Great. When you imagine Alexander the Great, you probably picture movement, cavalry charges, sunlit plains, the shock of battle unfolding at speed. History presents his campaigns as a blur of momentum, one victory flowing into the next, an army seemingly unstoppable as it crossed continents. But if you slow the image down, if you listen carefully, the dominant sound is not steel on steel. It is counting. Before any army moved, someone had to know how much grain remained, how many animals were still alive, how long leather sandals would last before splitting, how many days a man could march before hunger or illness turned discipline into disorder. Alexander's conquests did not advance on courage alone. They advanced on calculations made by men who never stood in formation. These were the quartermasters. You rarely see them named. They do not appear in dramatic speeches or heroic epics, yet they were present at every stop, every camp, every decision to advance or pause. They tracked supplies, organized transport, negotiated with local populations, and quietly told generals what was possible and what was not. Alexander inherited this system from his father, Philip II of Macedon, who understood that professional armies required professional logistics. Philip reformed the Macedonian military not only by improving weapons and tactics, but by reducing baggage and standardizing supply expectations. Soldiers carried more themselves. Camps were lighter. Movement was faster. But speed increases risk. That risk fell on the quartermasters. As the army marched east into unfamiliar terrain, their work grew harder and more essential. They faced environments they did not understand: arid plains, mountain passes, foreign cities with unknown customs. Maps were incomplete. Local calendars differed. Harvest cycles were unpredictable. Every day, someone had to decide whether the army could move tomorrow. You can imagine a quartermaster at dusk, kneeling beside a ledger or wax tablet listening to reports. How much grain collected today? How many animals lost? What prices did local merchants demand? Are the roads passable? How many carts remain functional? These decisions were not theoretical. A miscalculation could starve thousands. Alexander himself depended on these assessments, even if he rarely acknowledged them. His bold strategies, forced marches, surprise attacks, rapid advances were only possible because someone had confirmed quietly that they might succeed. And when they couldn't, the quartermasters had to find alternatives. Sometimes that meant negotiation. They arranged supply agreements with cities that surrendered peacefully. They coordinated markets where soldiers could buy food rather than steal it. This was not altruism. Plunder disrupted discipline. Stable supply kept order. Other times, it meant coercion. Quartermasters oversaw requisitions, ensuring that seized goods were recorded and distributed systematically. Even looting required structure. Behind every sack of grain taken, someone kept count. As the army moved deeper into Asia, distances grew. Supply lines stretched thin. Alexander often chose to live off the land, reducing reliance on long convoys. This shifted pressure onto local logistics. Quartermasters had to understand agricultural cycles quickly. Harvest too early and yields suffer. Harvest too late and the army starves. These men became reluctant experts in foreign farming. They learned which regions could support an army and which could not. They advised delays. They recommended routes that avoided depleted areas. Their advice shaped strategy more than speeches ever did. Yet their authority was informal. They could advise but not command. When Alexander ignored caution, they adapted. When forced marches exhausted men and animals, quartermasters rebalanced rations quietly, stretching supplies without announcing shortages. They also managed something rarely discussed: morale. Food is discipline. Regular rations keep soldiers predictable. Hunger breeds dissent. Quartermasters understood this intuitively. Even small reductions could destabilize units. So they smoothed distribution, rotated shortages, and disguised scarcity as routine. This was psychological labor. In camp, their work continued long after fighting stopped. They organized storage, guarded supplies from theft, and ensured sanitation around food sources. Spoiled grain could kill as effectively as enemy weapons. They learned to fear rot more than battle. As the army crossed into Persia, then further east, the complexity multiplied. New coinage systems, new weights, new languages. Quartermasters became translators of value, converting unfamiliar measures into usable quantities. A mistake here could double prices or have rations. And yet history remains silent about them. When battles were won, generals were praised. When cities fell, Alexander's name endured. When armies suffered, blame often fell on terrain or fate, rarely on logistics. But the truth remains: Alexander never outran his supplies. When he tried, men died. His eventual halt in India was not caused by defeat in battle, but by exhaustion of soldiers, animals, and supply systems. Quartermasters knew this before anyone else. They saw the numbers. They felt the strain. They warned. The army turned back not because Alexander lost ambition, but because the system that fed ambition reached its limit. And still, the quartermasters remained invisible. As you pause here, at the edge of this vast campaign, a quiet realization emerges. If the greatest conqueror of the ancient world depended so completely on people whose names history forgot, how much of his legend rests not on daring but on careful, unseen restraint? That question hangs unresolved, waiting for the next section. If you spent even a day with Alexander's quartermasters, you would quickly understand that their world was defined by numbers, distances, and the subtle rhythms of supply. They did not march with trumpets or fanfare. They marched alongside the wagons, the pack animals, the carts laden with grain, water, and weapons, calculating what could be carried, what must be left behind, and how to stretch finite resources across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain. Alexander's army was massive for its time. Tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of horses and pack animals, siege engines, and an assortment of artillery all needed to move in unison. Every man and beast required food, water, and rest. Every day, the quartermasters recorded consumption, predicted depletion, and adjusted the schedule. Miscalculation could lead to hunger, disease, and desertion, a domino effect that no battle plan could overcome. Consider the march into the Jedrosian desert. The soldiers had endured months of campaigning across Persia. Water was scarce, terrain was brutal, and temperatures soared. Quartermasters had scouted wells, calculated daily rations, and allocated camel and oxen loads with painstaking care. Still, they could not fully mitigate nature. Soldiers died. Animals perished. But the careful record-keeping and rationing saved thousands more than would have survived if left entirely to chance. Their work required constant adaptation. When the army crossed rivers, quartermasters coordinated ferries and pontoons. When bridges collapsed, they organized temporary crossings. When enemy forces threatened supply lines, they rerouted wagons and adjusted timing. Every decision balanced risk against necessity. Success was measured not by heroism, but by survival. These logistical decisions shaped strategy as much as combat did. Alexander often took bold risks, but his boldness relied on their calculations. He could cross a desert, storm a city, or conduct a rapid flanking maneuver only because quartermasters confirmed that food, water, and fodder could be delivered. Without that assurance, ambition would have been meaningless. Quartermasters also had to negotiate with local populations. They could not rely solely on looting. Doing so too aggressively would provoke rebellion and reduce available resources. They organized purchase agreements, managed local labor, and coordinated taxation in newly conquered territories. These actions were often invisible to history, but they were crucial for maintaining movement and cohesion. One of their most delicate tasks was managing animal health. Horses, oxen, camels, and pack mules were vital for mobility. Quartermasters scheduled rest, rotation, and feeding. A lost horse could stall a siege engine or halt an entire convoy. Disease among animals had to be anticipated and prevented with careful attention to water quality and grazing patterns. Even morale fell partially under their responsibility. Soldiers are surprisingly resilient, but hunger, thirst, and exhaustion are corrosive. Quartermasters ensured that rations were equitable, predictable, and reliable. They rotated supplies to prevent spoilage and minimize waste. They recorded who received what and adjusted distributions based on performance and need. This quiet orchestration prevented mutiny long enough for the army to continue its campaigns. And yet, the quartermasters were invisible. Ancient historians mention them only sporadically, as bureaucratic footnotes in campaigns dominated by heroism and conquest. Their lives were measured in ledgers and reports, not monuments or songs. Perhaps most strikingly, their labor often went against natural instincts. Soldiers might rush forward believing speed was essential. Quartermasters with access to data and experience often forced delays. They measured risk where generals measured glory. In countless cases, their insistence on order prevented catastrophe. Without them, Alexander's army might have been stopped not by the Persian Empire or Indian kingdoms, but by simple logistical collapse. The margin for error was thin. A miscount of grain could doom a month-long campaign. A misallocated wagon could strand a unit in enemy territory. Yet these men operated largely without recognition. Their authority derived from expertise and fear of failure rather than formal rank. By the time Alexander reached India, the limits of even their skill became evident. Soldiers mutinied not because of strategy, but because supply lines could no longer sustain them. Quartermasters had calculated risk, rationed food, and tried every practical method, but nature and exhaustion were relentless. The army turned back, not due to defeat in battle, but because even precise logistics could not overcome human and environmental limits. This illustrates a paradox. Quartermasters enabled conquest by providing structure, yet their work also defined the boundaries of possibility. They were the invisible governors of endurance. Their calculations determined not only survival but the reach of ambition itself. And their impact continued long after Alexander's death. Subsequent generals, attempting to expand or consolidate territories, inherited knowledge, maps, and practices developed by these quiet logisticians. Military campaigns without sufficient supply chains would repeatedly fail, proving that logistics, not courage alone, decides outcomes. Yet the question remains unresolved. If Alexander's glory depended so completely on the careful, unseen labor of these men, how much of history's story is truly about heroic leaders, and how much is about those who ensured that leaders could even move forward without collapsing under the weight of their own ambition? This question sets the stage for the final section of this story, where the legacy of these silent workers becomes clear, and the consequences of their invisibility are fully realized. By the time Alexander the Great turned his army back from the banks of the Hyphasis River in India, it had traveled farther than any Greek or Macedonian force in history. Armies had conquered cities, toppled kings, and rewritten borders. Historians remember the names of generals, the victories of cavalry, and the brilliance of tactics. But the true story, the reason the army had moved, survived, and even returned was almost entirely invisible. It was written in ledgers. Quartermasters' calculations had dictated routes, timelines, and rationing. They had balanced the unpredictable forces of terrain, weather, and human endurance. They had mitigated famine, disease, and desertion not by heroics, but by methodical planning. Without them, the army would have collapsed long before the final river crossing. Alexander's fame depended entirely on this hidden labor. After returning westward, the Macedonian army began to fragment. Soldiers exhausted, demoralized, or ill found it difficult to continue. Quartermasters continued their duties, moving supplies, ensuring that units could march home intact, managing transitions from foreign to familiar terrain. Without them, more men would have perished. The army may have disintegrated entirely. Even in victory, the quartermasters' work remained uncelebrated. Their names were not inscribed on monuments. They were rarely mentioned in surviving chronicles. Yet their influence outlasted Alexander himself. His generals and successors relied on supply chains, roads, and measurement practices established during his campaigns. Logistics became institutional knowledge, passed from one commander to the next, long after the army disbanded. The subtlety of their contribution also carried a lesson in restraint. Quartermasters constantly reminded generals of limits, often in opposition to ambition. When a commander wanted to march faster, strike sooner, or push further, quartermasters presented the constraints of food, water, and manpower. They had no swords, but they could stop armies through prudence. Their power was invisible but decisive. This pattern repeats across history. Armies crumble not because of the failure of courage, but because the systems supporting them collapse. Quartermasters, engineers, and clerks are the unseen guardians of empire, the quiet stabilizers upon which ambition leans. Alexander's empire expanded spectacularly, but it survived only as long as these invisible foundations held. And yet there is a paradox. Visibility invites reward. Invisibility invites endurance. Those who count, ration, and measure rarely receive recognition, but history would have been impossible without them. Consider the roads Alexander's army traveled. They were not paved for beauty or prestige, they were measured and maintained to carry food and soldiers efficiently. They outlasted campaigns. They shaped trade routes for centuries. The terrain may have shifted, rivers may have changed course, but the human footprint of careful logistical planning endured far longer than Alexander's brief reign. The same is true for the systems of measurement, record-keeping, and reporting developed by his quartermasters. These techniques became part of military culture across the Hellenistic world. Later empires inherited knowledge that allowed them to plan, sustain, and move forces with precision. That knowledge, like the roads themselves, quietly molded the future. Yet their anonymity also left vulnerabilities. Systems work only when trained, knowledgeable people maintain them. When quartermasters died, were reassigned, or lacked authority, entire campaigns faltered. The margin for error in ancient logistics was unforgiving, and yet few contemporary texts warn of it explicitly. Their silence has misled generations into believing that conquest is purely about leadership and courage. In fact, leadership is only as effective as its support structures. An army is not just men with swords. It is men with food, roads, knowledge, and the foresight to prevent collapse. Alexander's genius was amplified by quartermasters who made movement possible. Without them, even his brilliant tactics could not have succeeded. This realization forces us to reconsider how history assigns credit. Alexander's legacy is celebrated, but the silent men who measured distances, calculated rations, and organized supply lines laid the groundwork for survival. Their labor endured far beyond the battles they never commanded, and far beyond the fame of generals who relied on them. As centuries passed, the role of logistics became more formalized. Roman, Byzantine, and later European armies adopted systems of supply, measurement, and record-keeping, echoing the invisible practices developed in Alexander's campaigns. Modern militaries still rely on these foundational principles. Strategy without logistics is fantasy. Glory without sustenance is a fleeting illusion. So when you imagine conquest, remember this. The banners, the swords, the brilliant maneuvers are only visible markers of what truly allowed them to happen. The invisible calculations, careful rationing, and disciplined management enabled success. Alexander could have dreamed, fought, and planned endlessly, but without quartermasters, the army would have remained still. Their story is the quietest kind of heroism. It is endurance, precision, and patience. They ensured that history could unfold, even if they would never be named in it. And as this story closes, you are left with a thought that lingers. How many other famous achievements, wars, or empires depended on the labor of people history forgot? How often does progress depend not on brilliance or courage, but on quiet, careful, and often unrecognized work that keeps the world functioning just long enough for greatness to appear? Story 5. The Invisible Scribes of the Ottoman Empire. If you imagine the Ottoman Empire at its peak, the first images that might come to mind are grandiose, towering mosques, sprawling palaces, ornate courts, and the proud parade of janissaries marching in precise formation. History often emphasizes sultans, viziers, and generals leaders whose names echo through chronicles. But the empire's survival and cohesion depended on a far quieter, often invisible workforce, the scribes. These were not just clerks. They were the nervous system of an empire that stretched from the edges of the Mediterranean to the deserts of Arabia, the mountains of the Balkans to the banks of the Euphrates. Every decree, every tax record, every legal case, every trade license passed through their hands. Their pens carried the weight of administration, the authority of the sultan, and the lifeblood of a state. Ottoman scribes known as katibs operated in a hierarchy, trained rigorously in calligraphy, law, and procedure. The work required precision, patience, and absolute loyalty. Mistakes were not merely clerical. They could lead to lost revenue, disputes over land, or misdirected military orders. A miscopied tax list could starve a province. A miswritten decree could ignite rebellion. The scribe's day began early, often with prayer, followed by meticulous preparation of ink, paper, and parchment. They copied documents by hand, applying rules that had evolved over centuries, many inherited from earlier Islamic and Byzantine traditions. Some scribes were masters of divani script, a flowing, elegant hand used for official correspondence, while others specialized in nesi, a simpler, more functional script for records and registers. Each document they produced represented more than words, it represented governance. A revenue register, for example, documented not only the expected taxes, but the names of taxpayers, amounts, exemptions, and due dates. The clerical work created accountability, continuity, and traceability in an empire of astonishing size. The scribes' labor made abstract sovereignty concrete, reducing chaos to a system that could be understood, audited, and enforced. The Ottoman state was deeply hierarchical, and its bureaucracy reflected this. Scribes reported to higher-ranking officials who interpreted, verified, and forwarded documents, yet the flow of administration depended on accuracy at the lowest level. A single clerk's error could ripple upward, causing confusion in the palace or delays in provincial governance. The invisible workforce of scribes carried the empire on paper, line by line. Scribes also facilitated communication across vast distances. Letters sent from Istanbul to Baghdad, Cairo, or Belgrade passed through multiple clerks, each responsible for ensuring clarity and precision. They copied texts, sealed them, and sometimes translated them into local languages to prevent misunderstandings. The empire's ability to govern diverse regions depended heavily on this disciplined network of penmen. In addition to administrative work, scribes preserved knowledge. Court chronicles, legal opinions, and scientific texts were transcribed, allowing information to endure across generations. The Ottoman scribes acted as both administrators and archivists, maintaining a record of the empire's functioning long before modern bureaucracy existed. Yet for all their importance, scribes were rarely celebrated. Their names seldom appear in histories. They were shadows in the corridors of power, moving documents instead of armies, shaping policy through careful notation rather than rhetoric. The empire itself seemed to breathe and expand, yet it owed much of that vitality to the invisible hands that recorded its existence. This labor was relentless. The empire's bureaucracy demanded constant updates, new tax assessments, changes in land ownership, appointments of officials, decrees from the sultan. The scribes had to keep pace, often under pressure from superiors who expected perfection and speed. Any delay could cause political friction, economic imbalance, or military misalignment. Moreover, their work required judgment. A tax register might contain ambiguous entries, or a letter might carry instructions open to interpretation. Scribes were trained to reconcile discrepancies, apply precedent, and ensure the intended meaning was preserved. Their judgment operated quietly without recognition, yet it affected the lives of millions. The invisible labor of scribes also allowed the empire to survive political upheaval. When sultans died or were deposed, or when provincial governors changed, the continuity of administration remained. Laws could be enforced, taxes could be collected, military campaigns could continue. This stability came not from charisma or military might, but from disciplined documentation and the relentless copying of records. And yet their work was never complete. The empire expanded, populations grew, laws multiplied, and scribes multiplied in turn. The need for accuracy, repetition, and diligence never ended. They were caught in an endless cycle: record, verify, copy, archive. Mistakes were costly. Recognition was minimal. Theirs was the quietest form of service imaginable, yet it held an entire civilization together. By maintaining order in the details, the lists, the letters, the decrees, the scribes created the illusion of effortless governance. The sultan appeared omnipotent, the empire appeared invulnerable, and the subjects appeared compliant. All of this rested on labor that few would ever acknowledge. And here, as the first section closes, a question lingers. If the empire's endurance depended on these invisible hands, what might have been lost, forgotten, or mismanaged when scribes failed or were simply not there to record the details? How fragile was the facade of imperial power when it depended on so many people whose names history never recorded? If you lingered in the chambers where Ottoman scribes worked, you would notice a different rhythm than the one in the palaces or barracks. There were no drums, no marching feet, no fanfare, only the scratching of reed pens, the faint smell of ink, and the meticulous rustle of paper. Every line mattered, every word carried weight, and every decision could ripple through provinces, markets, and military campaigns. In the Ottoman Empire, the pen was as potent as the sword, and the scribes wielded it daily. These men, often anonymous in official records, were trained in disciplines that demanded extraordinary precision. They had to master multiple scripts: Divani for formal correspondence, Talic for documents that required elegance, and Nessi for registers and chronicles. Each script required not only artistic skill but readability and clarity. A single miswritten letter could confuse a tax assessment, misidentify a property, or invalidate a decree. The materials themselves posed challenges. Ink quality varied depending on region and season. Paper might be imported from distant lands, fragile and prone to tearing. Scribes had to test every batch, prepare ink carefully, and ensure that the writing surface could endure repeated handling. A faulty scroll could undo weeks of labor. Their attention to these details was painstaking, yet invisible to those who would benefit from their work. Beyond technical skill, scribes exercised judgment. Ottoman governance depended on a combination of centralized authority and local administration. A provincial governor might write a report with ambiguities, or a merchant might submit a petition with missing information. The scribe's role was to clarify, annotate, and sometimes adjust documents to align with the empire's legal and administrative frameworks. They became interpreters as much as recorders, translating human complexity into readable, actionable orders. Consider tax records. The empire relied on detailed assessments of land, production, and population. A scribe copying these records had to maintain exact figures, confirm calculations, and note exemptions. Errors could have immediate consequences. A village might be overtaxed, a military payroll mismanaged, or revenue for a campaign delayed. These decisions were made quietly, behind closed doors, with no applause and rarely any recognition. Yet they could shape the fortunes of regions and individuals alike. Scribes also facilitated communication across the empire's vast expanse. A decree issued in Istanbul could take weeks to reach Cairo, Baghdad, or Belgrade. Along the way, documents passed through dozens of hands. Each clerk verified, copied, and transmitted the information, ensuring that the emperor's intent remained intact. This chain of custody required discipline and reliability. Any break could lead to misinterpretation, conflict, or inefficiency. In times of military campaign, the scribe's work became even more critical. Orders for troop movements, supply allocations, and tax collection had to be exact. Miswriting could mean an army receives too few provisions or a contingent is sent to the wrong location. Scribes often traveled with military units, ensuring that written orders matched the reality on the ground. They were, in effect, the hidden gears turning behind the visible machinery of conquest and defense. Yet the role of scribes extended beyond administration and logistics. They were the custodians of memory. Chronicles, legal opinions, scientific treatises, and correspondence were transcribed and preserved. Without their efforts, knowledge could vanish in months or decades, especially in an empire where wars, plagues, and political upheavals threatened continuity. The survival of Ottoman culture, law, and scholarship owed much to the careful attention of these quiet laborers. Even within the bureaucracy, scribes navigated complex hierarchies. Superiors demanded speed and accuracy. Mistakes were punished. Diligence was expected. They worked long hours, often isolated, and yet the integrity of their work determined the empire's stability. Each document represented both obedience and responsibility. The Sultan's authority rested in part on their competence. But invisibility remained a defining feature. Official histories rarely recorded their names. Even in the most detailed chronicles, they are footnotes or omitted entirely. Success was measured not by personal recognition, but by the absence of error, the smooth functioning of administration, and the uninterrupted flow of information. A scribe's triumph was silence the state operated seamlessly because of their labor. This anonymity also created resilience. Because knowledge and process were encoded in practices and procedures rather than individual fame, scribes could be replaced, trained, and rotated without disrupting the system. The empire could endure the loss of individual workers without losing continuity. Yet it was also fragile. The quality of administration depended on the skill, diligence, and integrity of those who remained, an unseen but critical form of trust. And like the quartermasters of Alexander or the monks of Charlemagne, these scribes wielded quiet power. They could preserve or distort, clarify or confuse, maintain order or unintentionally introduce chaos. Their decisions, though made far from public view, echoed through the empire. The precision of administration, the enforcement of law, and the management of resources all depended on them. As the first section concluded, you may have wondered about the unseen human cost. Scribes worked long hours in confined spaces, often under the threat of punishment or dismissal. Mental strain was high. Errors carried consequences beyond paperwork. They could affect taxation, trade, and military readiness. Their labor was repetitive, painstaking, and largely uncelebrated. Yet without them, the Ottoman Empire could not have functioned as a coherent entity. Its survival, growth, and longevity depended on the meticulous work of people whose names history did not remember, but whose impact touched millions. And as you reflect on their quiet influence, a question remains unresolved. If an empire can expand, govern, and endure because of people who are largely invisible to history, what other civilizations owe their survival to labor that is never recorded, praised, or even acknowledged? By the time the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith in the 16th and 17th centuries, its administrative machinery had grown enormously complex. Provinces stretched across continents, languages varied, climates shifted, and local customs diverged. The sultans could issue edicts, the viziers could plan campaigns, and the armies could march, but none of it would function without the scribes, who acted as both translators and custodians of continuity. They were the invisible foundation upon which the empire rested. Scribes maintained this continuity in ways few outside the bureaucracy could appreciate. When a new governor was appointed, he did not begin in ignorance. The scribes ensured that tax records, property disputes, military obligations, and local ordinances were documented, organized, and available. A province could continue functioning almost seamlessly despite changes in leadership, because the institutional memory had been preserved on paper. The continuity of governance depended on meticulous transcription, indexing, and verification. Even legal systems relied on scribes. Court decisions were recorded, appeals documented, and precedents referenced. Judges might come and go, but the records remained, ensuring consistency across centuries. Without these written accounts, law could have been arbitrary, dependent entirely on memory and personal discretion. The scribes' labor created stability in a realm where memory alone would have been insufficient. Their work extended to finance as well. Tax collection, military provisioning, and palace expenditures required precise accounting. Scribes tallied revenues, monitored expenditures, and reconciled discrepancies. Mismanagement could lead to famine, rebellion, or economic collapse. The empire's ability to collect revenue and redistribute resources relied on their careful calculations. A ledger in the hands of a diligent scribe was as vital as a cannon on the battlefield. Scribes were also key in communication networks. Messages had to travel long distances, often crossing seas and mountains, between Istanbul and provincial centers such as Aleppo, Baghdad, or Cairo. Each document, decrees, instructions, or reports was copied, verified, and sometimes translated to ensure accuracy. The chain was fragile. A single error could mislead a governor, delay military operations, or disrupt taxation. Yet the system worked because of the rigor and discipline of these invisible clerks. Even cultural preservation depended on them. Histories, chronicles, poetry, scientific texts, and religious commentaries were copied, archived, and curated. The survival of Ottoman literature, law, and scholarship owes a silent debt to these workers who produced texts not for fame, but for endurance. Without them, the empire's intellectual heritage would be fragmented or lost entirely. What is remarkable is how little recognition these scribes received. They operated in a culture where visibility was reserved for rulers, warriors, and celebrated scholars. Yet their work shaped the everyday life of millions. Every successful tax collection, every smooth administrative transition, every military campaign partially depended on their diligence. Their names might never appear in history books, but their influence was omnipresent. The consequences of their absence were equally stark. When scribes were overworked, untrained, or removed due to political purges, mistakes cascaded. Provinces were mismanaged, armies missed, and the authority of the central government weakened. History is full of examples where poor record-keeping led to unrest or failure. The empire's stability was always as fragile as the accuracy of the documents that sustained it. Yet for all their invisibility, the scribes held a unique kind of power. They were arbiters of order in a world of complexity. They determined what was recorded, what was preserved, and what could be referenced. In subtle ways, they shaped decisions from the shadows. A scribe's careful notation could allow a reform to succeed, or the absence of documentation could hinder change for decades. The lessons from their labor extend beyond the Ottoman Empire. In any society, large or small, those who manage, record, and maintain the flow of information are critical. Leaders may make decisions, armies may fight, and rulers may be celebrated, but the invisible workers are often the ones ensuring that actions have consequences, that orders are followed, and that knowledge endures. By the late Ottoman period, technology began to change, introducing printing, new archival systems, and eventually modern bureaucracy. Yet the principles established by these scribes, the careful copying, verification, and preservation of information, remained central. They had built a culture of continuity that survived centuries, long after individual names faded. As this story draws to a close, a reflection emerges. Empires are not built on ambition alone. They are sustained by quiet labor, meticulous attention, and disciplined, often unrecognized effort. The sultans of Istanbul could conquer lands and command armies, but without the invisible scribes, their authority would have been incomplete, fragile, and impermanent. And the unresolved thought lingers. How many other civilizations, celebrated for their leaders and victories, owe their survival to the countless unseen individuals whose labor history forgot? What would the world have looked like if these scribes, the guardians of continuity, had chosen negligence over diligence, invisibility over endurance? In the quiet, repetitive scratching of ink on paper, history was not only recorded, it was preserved, maintained, and made possible for generations to come. And it is precisely this invisible labor that ensured the Ottoman Empire endured far longer than any individual ruler's memory. Story 6. The unseen builders of the Inca road system. When people imagine the Inca Empire, they picture Machu Picchu, terraces carved into mountainsides, or armies marching along jagged ridges. But the empire's true power lay not only in stone cities or military organization, but in its roads. Thousands of kilometers of carefully constructed paths connecting the vast, rugged Andes. The Inca did not leave written records for us to read, yet their empire functioned efficiently, largely because of the labor of countless unnamed builders who carved, maintained, and mapped these roads, workers whose lives and names have been almost entirely forgotten. The Inca roads were engineering marvels, yet they were practical above all. They had to carry people, goods, and messages across mountains, valleys, and deserts. Travelers faced steep cliffs, heavy rainfall, and landslides. Building and maintaining roads in this terrain required not only skill but intimate knowledge of local geography, soil, and stone. These builders understood mountains as living systems, where water would flow, where rocks could be pried free, where steps or retaining walls were necessary to prevent collapse. Laborers were organized in midda, the rotational labor system that required communities to contribute workers for state projects. Men carried stones, quarried rock, constructed bridges, and layered gravel. Women often prepared mortar, reinforced walls, or maintained paths. Their contribution was compulsory, yet essential, and it often went unnoticed beyond local communities. Unlike rulers or generals, these workers left no inscriptions celebrating their efforts. The roads themselves became their monument, durable, functional, yet anonymous. The complexity of the road system was astounding. Roads were often terraced along cliffs, paved with cobblestones, and engineered to survive intense rainfall. Drainage systems were integrated into steps and slopes to prevent erosion. Switchbacks reduced gradients on steep inclines. Retaining walls reinforced fragile sections. Rope bridges spanned gorges. Every aspect required careful observation and repeated maintenance. A poorly constructed path could collapse, isolating communities, delaying messengers, and disrupting trade or military movements. These roads carried not armies in the sense of mass soldiers, but networks of runners called chasquis. These men, trained from youth, could sprint for miles, relaying messages along the road system with remarkable speed. Each relay relied on clear, reliable paths, with way stations spaced at intervals where runners could rest and exchange messages. The speed of communication depended entirely on the accuracy and stability of the laborers' construction. Yet the laborers themselves were rarely credited. The Inca political system emphasized collective work and imperial authority, not individual recognition. Builders were essential to imperial cohesion, but their presence was absorbed into the functioning of the state. Without them, the empire's communication, military coordination, and administration would have faltered. Roads also served economic functions. They facilitated trade and movement of goods, potatoes, maize, textiles, and metals from one region to another. Llamas carried cargo along paths too narrow for carts, while builders ensured slopes, bridges, and retaining walls could support the loads. Roads allowed resources to flow from agricultural valleys to cities, fortresses, and religious centers. The empire's economic stability rested on the integrity of paths carved and maintained by laborers whose names history forgot. Moreover, the roads were tools of governance. Governors, messengers, and tax collectors used them to enforce state authority. When a region resisted, officials could move swiftly. When tribute needed collection, administrators could reach remote settlements. Roads were arteries of control, yet each relied on thousands of unseen hands for survival and reliability. The laborers also had to contend with natural hazards. Landslides, floods, and earthquakes threatened road integrity. Builders employed techniques like terracing, stone walls, and drainage channels to mitigate these risks. Maintenance was ongoing. A path was never complete. Even after initial construction, the empire relied on communities to repair, reinforce, and clear roads. The work was relentless, continuous, and deeply human, reflecting patience, skill, and intimate understanding of the environment. As you consider these builders, it becomes clear that their contribution was both functional and strategic. Without roads, messengers could not relay imperial decrees, armies could not mobilize efficiently, and trade networks would falter. Yet, they remained invisible in the historical record. We remember the empire's rulers, ceremonial centers, and architectural masterpieces, but the roads themselves and the labor behind them are almost anonymous in history. And yet, in their anonymity, they created something enduring. Modern studies show that much of the Inca road network aligns with contemporary trails and highways. The work of these laborers continues to shape transportation and communication in the Andes centuries later. Their precision, persistence, and knowledge of the land outlasted the empire itself. By the end of this first section, a question emerges. If the strength and cohesion of one of the largest pre-Columbian empires depended so completely on the quiet labor of these unnamed builders, how much of history rests on the invisible hands of those whose work was never celebrated, only endured? To understand the Inca road system, you have to imagine an empire where written language as we know it did not exist. The Inca communicated primarily through quipu, knotted strings that recorded numbers and messages, but the majority of their knowledge, engineering, maintenance, logistics, was transmitted through practice. The laborers building and maintaining roads relied on observation, repetition, and oral instruction, rather than formal manuals. Each stone laid, each retaining wall constructed, each drainage channel dug carried with it generations of accumulated knowledge. Picture a team of workers perched on a steep slope, moving rocks heavier than a man's torso. They shape stones with rudimentary tools, hammerstones, chisels, and wooden levers until they fit precisely into terraces. These terraces do more than hold the road. They stabilize the mountainside against erosion and landslides. Every alignment, every curve, every step is calculated intuitively, passed down from experienced builders to apprentices. The mountains are their textbook, the stones their notation. Mistakes are costly. One misaligned stone can start a cascade of failure, literally and figuratively. The laborers' expertise extended to drainage and water management. Rain is frequent and intense in the Andes. Without channels and slopes to divert water, roads would wash away, isolating villages and cutting off messengers. Builders engineered drainage channels integrated seamlessly with terraces and paths. These channels follow natural contours, using gravity to move water away efficiently. They are subtle, often invisible at first glance, but they prevent collapse and prolong usability. Each channel represents knowledge accumulated through trial, error, and observation, preserved in the silent memory of the workforce. Bridges posed another challenge. The Inca relied on suspension bridges made from woven grass ropes, spanning deep gorges. Each bridge had to bear the weight of llamas, people, and sometimes military contingents. Builders constructed, maintained, and replaced these bridges regularly, teaching the next generation how to weave, tension, and anchor the ropes securely. These bridges were temporary, yet essential links, connecting a permanent network of roads across an impermanent landscape. The builder's skill ensured survival in a terrain where misstep could be fatal. Organization was key. Builders worked in teams with defined roles. Some quarried and shaped stones, others laid terraces, others reinforced embankments. Local communities contributed labor through the Midas system, creating a rotation that allowed the empire to maintain a workforce without entirely stripping villages of their own labor. Skilled overseers coordinated these teams, making sure techniques were uniform, quality consistent, and construction aligned with broader road networks. These overseers, like the workers, remain unnamed. Records of individuals do not survive. Their legacy is the roads themselves, precise, functional, and durable. When you walk along a surviving Inca trail, every step represents the labor of people whose lives are largely lost to history. The roads are both monument and instruction manual, silently teaching endurance, patience, and applied knowledge. The roads were not purely functional. They were also strategic. Military and administrative movement depended on them. Messengers, chasquis, could traverse hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days, relaying instructions, gathering information, and ensuring the Sultan, or in this case, the Sapa Inca, maintained control over distant regions. This speed depended entirely on the labor of builders and maintainers, whose meticulous construction made such movement possible. Every stone and terrace allowed power to radiate across the empire. Yet the builders faced constant challenges. Natural disasters could destroy weeks of work overnight. Landslides required rebuilding entire sections. Heavy rains washed away gravel. Earthquakes cracked terraces and destabilized paths. Builders had to anticipate these hazards, adapt techniques, and coordinate repairs across vast distances. Maintenance was endless, and the knowledge required to do it was transmitted orally, embedded in practice, rather than recorded in texts. Without these hands, the empire's logistical system would have crumbled long before it reached its maximum extent. Perhaps most striking is the scale of labor. The road network stretched over 40,000 kilometers through deserts, mountains, and jungles. Coordinating construction across such terrain required not just skill, but dedication, organization, and trust in unseen hierarchies of labor. Workers had to understand local conditions while following techniques standardized enough to ensure cohesion across thousands of kilometers. The human capacity to achieve this, with no formal written instructions, speaks to the quiet genius of the unnamed workforce. As you reflect on their work, a subtle tension becomes clear. These builders created permanence in a harsh, impermanent environment. Every stone laid and every drainage channel dug represented knowledge, skill, and endurance. Yet they themselves were subject to the rhythms of life and death in the mountains. They labored without fame, without recognition, often in dangerous conditions, for the survival of a system that outlasted them. And here the story leaves you with a question. If the cohesion and speed of the Inca Empire rested on the labor of these invisible builders, how much of history is shaped not by the famous rulers, but by those whose precision, endurance, and skill made empire possible, yet whose names we will never know? When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were astounded not just by the cities of the Inca, but by the roads connecting them. From high mountain passes shrouded in clouds to river valleys carved with precision terraces, the road system was the empire's lifeline. The conquistadors often noted the quality and extent of the paths, yet the people who built and maintained them, the thousands of anonymous laborers, were invisible in their accounts. Their work had become so seamless that it seemed natural, almost inevitable. Yet without it, the Inca Empire could not have functioned. The roads continued to facilitate movement after the fall of the empire. Spanish colonial administrators, missionaries, and traders relied on these paths to traverse the Andes, distribute resources, and maintain control over vast territories. What was created for one empire became the foundation for another. The labor of those unnamed builders, their knowledge of terrain, drainage, and construction, outlasted the empire itself. Every stone, every terrace, every rope bridge preserved a methodology for survival in a rugged, challenging landscape. The legacy of the Inca builders was not only in stone, but also in the principles of organization and labor management. The MITA system, which rotated workers between local communities and state projects, ensured that labor was sustained without destabilizing villages. This system, combined with careful oversight by skilled supervisors, created a network of knowledge, responsibility, and endurance. It was a social and logistical innovation as much as an engineering one. Consider the paths that climbed the steepest ridges. They required not only technical skill but intimate ecological understanding. Builders chose routes that minimized erosion, leveraged natural ledges, and avoided unstable rock formations. They anticipated rainfall, snowmelt, and seasonal changes. Every stone had a purpose, every terrace an intention. Maintenance teams had to constantly monitor these fragile but vital passages, repairing landslides, clearing debris, and reinforcing walls. The roads were alive, demanding attention and care, and their survival depended on the unseen laborers who kept them functional. The roads also reinforced cohesion across the empire. Messages moved swiftly via chasquis, provisions reached distant armies and cities, and officials could travel between the center and periphery. In a land where rivers could not always be navigated and mountains separated populations, roads were the veins carrying life, authority, and stability. The empire's strength lay not just in its military or ceremonial centers, but in this silent infrastructure maintained by laborers whose skill and diligence allowed centralized power to function. And yet these laborers remained largely invisible to history. They were part of the collective, absorbed into the concept of the state, and their personal stories, hardship, skill, endurance went unrecorded. We know of them only through the paths that survive, the terraces that still cling to mountainsides, the rope bridges reconstructed by modern archaeologists. Their legacy is structural, functional, enduring, but anonymous. This anonymity underscores a paradox of historical memory. Those whose work is essential for survival are often forgotten, while those who benefit from it, rulers, generals, and elites, are celebrated. The Inca builders exemplify this pattern. Without their labor, the empire could not administer its population, collect tribute, or defend its territory. Yet the empire's collapse following Spanish conquest obscured their contributions. Roads remained, laborers did not. Even today, remnants of the Inca road system continue to shape life in the Andes. Modern trails follow ancient paths, sometimes using the same terraces and stonework. Local communities rely on these routes for transportation, commerce, and cultural exchange. The endurance of these paths is a testament to the precision, knowledge, and persistence of the laborers who built them centuries ago. Their work transcended their lifetimes, enabling movement and connectivity long after the empire itself disappeared. As you consider the broader implications, one truth emerges. The survival of complex societies often depends on the unnoticed, uncelebrated work of ordinary people. Builders, scribes, quartermasters, engineers, these roles appear mundane, repetitive, and invisible in historical narratives, yet they are the foundation of achievement. Without them, empires crumble, campaigns fail, and communication collapses. Without their careful, persistent labor, history as we know it would be unrecognizable. The Inca roads, stretching across thousands of kilometers and surviving centuries of environmental change and political upheaval, are monuments not to rulers or generals, but to the unnamed laborers. Their endurance speaks to human skill, patience, and dedication. Their invisibility reminds us that history is shaped not only by ambition and glory, but by quiet, meticulous, and enduring labor. As this story concludes, the lingering question is unavoidable. How many other great achievements in history, empires, conquests, monumental architecture depend on invisible workers whose names we will never know, whose contributions are critical, yet unrecorded? And what does it mean for us today that so much of human success has been built upon labor that remains anonymous, silent, and overlooked? Story 7. The Hidden Archivists of Medieval European Monasteries. When most people think of medieval Europe, images of knights, castles, and epic battles often dominate their imagination. Yet another, quieter world existed within stone walls and cloistered courtyards. The world of monasteries, where knowledge was preserved, copied, and transmitted across centuries. The monks and scribes who worked within these walls were not celebrated for heroism or conquest. Their victories were invisible, the survival of texts, ideas, and the intellectual foundation of Europe. They were the hidden archivists, custodians of a culture that might otherwise have been lost. These men lived in austere conditions. Monks followed strict routines: prayer, work, study. Among their duties, the copying and maintenance of manuscripts consumed a significant portion of their days. Illuminated Bibles, theological treatises, classical texts, and scientific works were painstakingly transcribed, letter by letter, often with intricate decorations and precise annotations. Mistakes were corrected with care, for a miswritten word could distort meaning, mislead a student, or misinform future clerics. The scriptorium, the room dedicated to copying manuscripts, was a place of quiet discipline. Natural light streamed through small windows, illuminating rows of desks where scribes bent over vellum or parchment. Quills were sharpened daily, ink carefully prepared, and pages meticulously ruled to guide the text. Every stroke of the pen was deliberate. Every sheet represented hours of labor. Monks worked in a rhythm dictated by both devotion and the practical demands of preservation. This labor was more than clerical. Copying a manuscript required comprehension, not rote transcription. Scribes often consulted multiple sources, cross-referenced texts, and corrected inconsistencies. They were editors as much as copyists, ensuring that knowledge survived in coherent, usable form. Their work created a bridge between past and future. Without their diligence, much of classical antiquity works by Aristotle, Cicero, or Galen might have been lost entirely. Libraries in monasteries became repositories of memory, where texts were stored, cataloged, and protected. The archivists developed methods to classify, preserve, and retrieve manuscripts long before modern library science existed. They had to contend with decay, insects, moisture, and fire. Each book was fragile, and each transcription was an act of survival. The physical preservation of knowledge required both skill and foresight. The impact of their work extended far beyond the monastery walls. Scholars, clergy, and eventually universities relied on these preserved texts. Legal systems, theological debates, scientific inquiry, and philosophical discourse all depended on the survival of manuscripts maintained by anonymous scribes. The European Renaissance, which celebrated humanism and rediscovery, drew heavily on texts preserved in monastic libraries, texts that survived wars, plagues, and political upheavals, thanks to the vigilance of these archivists. Yet their labor was almost entirely invisible. The monks were celebrated for piety, obedience, and ascetic life, but rarely for intellectual labor. Their names seldom appear in historical accounts unless they were abbots or exceptionally prominent scholars. The thousands of hours spent copying texts, annotating margins, and repairing manuscripts left no trace beyond the survival of the knowledge itself. Their reward was endurance, not fame. The work also had practical challenges. Manuscripts were expensive to produce. Parchment or vellum had to be prepared from animal skins, ink mixed from natural ingredients, and quills fashioned from bird feathers. Scribes needed steady hands, good eyesight, and patience. Mistakes could ruin a page, requiring starting over from scratch. They often worked for decades on a single text. This repetitive labor demanded discipline and resilience, qualities honed within the monastery's strict rhythm. Beyond preservation, monks contributed to innovation. Some developed new scripts to increase readability, abbreviations to save space, or annotation systems to clarify meaning. Marginalia recorded commentary, corrections, or references to other works. In a sense, the scribes were not just archivists, they were early editors, librarians, and information managers, ensuring that knowledge was accessible, accurate, and resilient across generations. Even in times of crisis, their work continued. During wars, invasions, or plagues, monasteries often became sanctuaries for texts. When abbeys were threatened, manuscripts were hidden, transported, or copied in secret. This continuity ensured that knowledge survived beyond the turbulence of political or social upheaval. History itself leaned on the persistence of these archivists, though history rarely acknowledged them. By the end of this first section, a key question arises. If the intellectual foundation of Europe, the rediscovery of classical texts, the spread of scientific inquiry, and the education of future generations depended so heavily on these hidden archivists, how much of what we call cultural achievement is built on labor that is invisible, repetitive, and largely unacknowledged? In the quiet heart of a medieval monastery, the scriptorium was a place of remarkable order and relentless precision. Here, the hidden archivists devoted themselves to a task that few outside the cloister could fully appreciate: copying, correcting, and preserving texts so that knowledge would survive not just their own lifetimes, but centuries beyond. Unlike soldiers or rulers, their work left no immediate mark on the world. Its significance was measured in decades and centuries, not in battles or proclamations. Each scribe's day began with preparation. Parchment had to be carefully selected, scraped, and smoothed. Ink required precise mixtures: soot or gall for black, plants or minerals for color. Quills had to be cut and shaped daily. These details were crucial. A single mistake could ruin a manuscript, and the materials themselves were expensive and labor-intensive. Wasting a page was not just an inconvenience, it was a loss of knowledge and resources. Once the writing began, the work required both physical dexterity and intellectual engagement. Scribes copied texts line by line, often consulting multiple sources to ensure accuracy. They compared manuscripts, corrected errors, and sometimes annotated passages to clarify meaning or note variant readings. A scribe was simultaneously a copyist, editor, and early scholar, translating complex ideas into durable, legible form. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, balancing the necessity of preservation with the limitations of fragile materials. The process was painstakingly slow. A single manuscript could take months or even years to complete. Scribes had to maintain consistency in handwriting, spacing, and ink density. Even minor deviations could confuse later readers or make text less useful for study. The labor was repetitive, sometimes tedious, yet absolutely essential. Without this painstaking work, ideas from ancient Rome, Greece, or early Christian theologians could have vanished entirely. Preservation extended beyond mere copying. Monasteries faced constant threats: fires, floods, decay, pests, and political turmoil. Archivists developed methods to protect manuscripts, storing them on shelves in chests or hidden vaults. They repaired damaged texts, rewrote faded passages, and sometimes recopied entire works that showed signs of wear. Every act of preservation was a calculated intervention, maintaining a fragile bridge between past and future. The work required extraordinary collaboration and communication. Senior scribes trained novices, passing on techniques and standards. Corrections and annotations had to be consistent, especially in monasteries that maintained large collections. Knowledge was codified in practice rather than formal manuals, and the survival of skills depended on mentorship and repetition. In this way, the scriptorium functioned as both a workshop and a school, cultivating expertise that would endure for generations. Archivists also performed a subtle but powerful role in shaping the content of knowledge. By deciding which texts to copy, annotate, or preserve, they influenced what ideas would survive. The manuscripts that were prioritized Bibles, theological treatises, classical works shaped the intellectual landscape of Europe. In this sense, the scribes were not passive recorders. They were curators of culture, filtering the flood of available knowledge into a durable, accessible corpus. Even as they shaped intellectual history, the archivists remained invisible. Monastic chronicles might note abbots, abbesses, or major donors, but the names of ordinary scribes rarely appear. Their success was measured in the survival of texts, not in recognition. A scribe's triumph was the continuation of a work beyond their lifetime, its ideas accessible to scholars yet unborn, its presence enduring when the scribe had long passed. The cumulative effect of this labor cannot be overstated. Without the hidden archivists, the Renaissance might have lacked the classical texts that inspired humanist thought. Scientific inquiry, legal traditions, philosophical exploration all relied on manuscripts preserved and transmitted by these men and women. They acted as the invisible connective tissue linking the ancient world to the modern, safeguarding knowledge through centuries of instability. Their work was not glamorous. It was repetitive, meticulous, and largely unseen. They endured the monotony and physical strain of copying for the sake of preservation. Their reward was neither wealth nor fame, only the knowledge that their labor might ensure survival, even if they themselves would never know the ultimate impact. This quiet, persistent effort illustrates a pattern seen repeatedly throughout history. Those whose labor is most essential are often the least recognized. And yet, the archivists wielded immense power in their subtle way. A miscopied text could alter interpretation for centuries. The selection of which works to preserve or prioritize influenced the intellectual development of future societies. The archivists' decisions, though invisible and incremental, shaped the trajectory of European thought, law, and culture in profound ways. By the end of this section, the unacknowledged labor of scribes emerges as a linchpin of historical continuity. The survival of knowledge through the medieval period, the foundation of universities, and the rediscovery of classical ideas in the Renaissance depended on these quiet workers. Their labor reminds us that history is not only forged in battlefields and courts, but in the careful, persistent, and disciplined preservation of knowledge. And as this section closes, a question lingers. If entire intellectual and cultural movements depend on the careful, often unseen work of archivists, how different would history have been if even a small portion of this labor had failed? How fragile is the bridge between past and present when it relies on the invisible hands of the dedicated but anonymous? As centuries passed, the work of monastic scribes and archivists bore fruit that few could fully appreciate. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was emerging from turmoil. Kingdoms were stabilizing, trade networks were expanding, and universities were beginning to flourish. Yet the intellectual and cultural foundation for this revival owed an enormous debt to countless monks who labored quietly in scriptoriums, long before the term Renaissance had even been imagined. Without their care, large swathes of ancient knowledge, philosophy, law, science, and theology would have been irretrievably lost. The survival of texts such as Aristotle's works, Galen's medical treatises, and Cicero's writings depended on these archivists. Each manuscript represented months or years of painstaking effort, parchment prepared, ink mixed, quills sharpened, and letters transcribed with exacting care. The repetition was grueling. Errors required correction or complete restart. And yet, through patience and discipline, scribes preserved knowledge that would eventually inspire thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, and Descartes. The Renaissance itself would have been inconceivable without the labor of these anonymous custodians. The scriptoriums also established systems of organization that prefigured modern library science. Manuscripts were cataloged, labeled, and stored according to principles designed to make retrieval possible even decades later. Marginal notes, indices, and cross-references created a network of information that scholars could navigate, long before printed books standardized access. Archivists were, in effect, early librarians, engineers of intellectual memory. Their work ensured that knowledge remained coherent, accessible, and connected across time. Moreover, the influence of these archivists extended beyond academia. Legal codes, theological doctrines, and administrative practices were preserved because scribes ensured the texts were copied accurately. Kings, bishops, and rulers relied on these documents to govern, resolve disputes, and justify policies. Decisions in courts and councils often reference manuscripts meticulously maintained by monks. In effect, the scribes became invisible pillars of societal stability. Without them, governance and law might have fractured as readily as knowledge. The work also required moral and intellectual discipline. Scribes took oaths of obedience, but their labor demanded personal integrity. Errors could propagate misinformation. Omissions could erase ideas entirely. Copying was not mechanical, it was interpretive. Each decision about how to transcribe, annotate, or clarify mattered. The archivist's judgment was silent but profound. They shaped the intellectual heritage of Europe not through fame, but through precision and perseverance. Their invisibility is perhaps the most striking aspect of their legacy. While abbots and theologians are remembered, the thousands of scribes remain nameless. Yet the continuity of civilization relied on them. The preservation of classical knowledge, the stability of law, and the intellectual resources of emerging universities all depended on hands that history largely ignored. Their anonymity underscores a larger truth. Essential work often goes unrecognized, yet it is indispensable. Even in crises, plagues, invasions, or political upheaval, the scribes' work persisted. Libraries were protected, manuscripts hidden or transported, and copying continued. Their commitment ensured that knowledge outlasted the destruction around it. In monasteries across Europe, these archivists created temporal bridges that connected the ancient world to modernity. Their labor was slow, methodical, and invisible, yet its impact was enduring. The survival of European civilization during periods of instability illustrates a profound principle. History is as much about endurance and preservation as it is about conquest and creativity. Scribes did not wield swords, negotiate treaties, or lead armies, yet they ensured that knowledge survived for the use of those who would. Without their work, Renaissance thinkers would have had nothing to rediscover. Legal systems would have lacked continuity. Scientific progress would have been delayed for generations. Civilization itself relied on these quiet, persistent hands. As you reflect on this, a question emerges that resonates across time. How much of what we consider human achievement is dependent on labor that is unseen, uncelebrated, and often invisible? From scribes to archivists, from builders to quartermasters, history is sustained by those whose names do not appear in textbooks, yet whose contributions make progress possible. Their lives and labor are reminders that the scaffolding of civilization is largely hidden from view, yet indispensable. The hidden archivists of medieval European monasteries teach us a subtle but profound lesson. Preservation, continuity, and meticulous attention to detail are as powerful as genius or ambition. They remind us that knowledge itself is fragile, and that the survival of ideas often hinges on ordinary humans doing extraordinary work quietly and consistently. The world we inhabit today, the texts we read, the laws we follow, the intellectual heritage we inherit owes a debt to these silent custodians, whose efforts were neither recognized nor celebrated in their time, but whose influence continues to shape every generation that follows. History, therefore, is not only a story of leaders, battles, and monumental events. It is a story of endurance, careful labor, and invisible diligence. And perhaps the most enduring question is this: if the survival of civilization depends on hands we will never know, how might our understanding of history change when we look not only to the famous, but to the quiet, the repetitive, and the unacknowledged? Story 8. The Unsung Dockworkers of the Han Dynasty. When people think of the Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, their minds often turn to emperors, generals, scholars, and inventors, the celebrated figures who appear in history books. Yet the dynasty's vast success, its ability to govern millions across diverse landscapes, relied on countless laborers who rarely received recognition. The dockworkers who loaded, unloaded, and transported goods along rivers, canals, and ports. Their toil formed the unseen backbone of an empire, sustaining trade, supply chains, and administration across thousands of kilometers. The Han Dynasty encompassed regions as varied as fertile river valleys, mountainous interiors, and arid deserts. Rivers and canals were the arteries of commerce and communication, enabling grain, salt, textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods to move between regions. Dockworkers managed this flow, often under grueling conditions. They lifted sacks of grain, heaved crates of silk, and handled heavy bronze and iron implements. Each shipment they moved contributed directly to the economic stability of the state, the provisioning of armies, and the survival of urban populations. Dockwork was physically demanding. Laborers often worked from dawn to dusk, balancing cargo on slippery docks or uneven riverbanks. They navigated tides, seasonal flooding, and the unpredictable currents of rivers such as the Yangtze and Yellow River. Accidents were common. Injuries could be severe, yet their labor was indispensable. Without their efforts, imperial granaries would have emptied, armies would have gone unfed, and the vibrant trade that enriched the Han Dynasty would have faltered. Organization was central to the efficiency of dock operations. Port authorities and overseers directed the movement of goods, assigned laborers to tasks, and maintained order. However, the work still relied heavily on human skill and endurance. Loading a barge or cart required precise weight distribution to prevent capsizing. Grain had to be measured, recorded, and transferred without waste. Luxury goods demanded careful handling. Even minor errors could lead to losses, shortages, or delays that cascaded across the empire. Dockworkers also played a role in military logistics. The Han Dynasty's armies required constant resupply of food, weapons, and equipment, particularly during campaigns in the north against the Xiongnu, or in the south to expand influence over modern-day Vietnam. Supplies moved along canals, rivers, and ports, coordinated by laborers whose work ensured that soldiers could march, fight, and survive far from their home provinces. Without dockworkers, strategic plans could have been doomed before battle even began. Beyond logistics, dockworkers contributed to the broader economy. Markets in cities like Chang'an and Luoyang depended on the constant arrival of goods. Taxes and tributes, often collected in kind, moved via river systems to the imperial treasury. Laborers were essential for this flow. They ensured that commerce operated smoothly, yet they were almost invisible in the records that celebrated merchants, officials, and emperors. Their toil, repetitive and physically grueling, sustained the empire's wealth and cohesion without acknowledgement. The work required not just strength but expertise. Dockworkers knew river currents, tidal patterns, and seasonal weather changes. They coordinated the timing of shipments, balancing labor availability with water levels. They could predict hazards such as floods or storms and adjust operations accordingly. Their experience, though rarely documented, was critical. Empires rise and fall on logistics, and in the Han Dynasty, the labor of these unseen workers allowed the state to function at scale. Dock labor also had a social dimension. Many workers came from rural villages, drafted or conscripted through local obligations. Their labor connected urban centers with hinterlands, binding disparate regions together through practical, hands-on work. These workers were part of the invisible social infrastructure that enabled imperial control, much like scribes, road builders, or quartermasters in other civilizations. And yet their labor remained largely unacknowledged. Historical accounts focus on campaigns, policy decisions, or economic reforms, while the daily toil of dockworkers lifting, moving, organizing, coordinating goes almost entirely unrecorded. Their impact is measurable only in what survived: stocked granaries, successful military campaigns, bustling markets, and flowing trade along rivers. Their success was measured in the absence of disaster, in the smooth functioning of systems that others took for granted. As the first section closes, consider this: the prosperity, stability, and expansion of one of the most celebrated dynasties in Chinese history depended on the coordinated effort of countless invisible hands. Without the dockworkers' labor, the empire's supply chains would have faltered, armies might have starved, and cities could have collapsed under logistical strain. And yet, history remembers the emperors who claimed glory and power, rarely the people who made that power possible. So the question lingers: how many great civilizations, celebrated for their rulers and innovations, relied on the unnoticed toil of ordinary laborers, people whose names and stories have been lost, but whose work shaped the course of history? If you could step onto a Han Dynasty dock in the early morning, you would encounter a scene both chaotic and highly organized. Barges bobbed along riverbanks, loaded with grain, silk, salt, and bronze. Laborers shouted instructions, heaved heavy sacks, and coordinated the transfer of goods onto waiting carts or vessels. The rhythmic sound of labor feet on planks, crates sliding, ropes creaking, was the heartbeat of an empire. Without it, the cities, armies, and administrators that we associate with Han prosperity could not function. The docks were not simple storage areas. They were logistical hubs. Grain collected from fertile river valleys was destined for urban granaries, military garrisons, and imperial storehouses. Salt mined from inland lakes traveled downstream to coastal markets. Metal ores and finished goods moved along the rivers to craft centers and trading hubs. Each shipment had to be carefully counted, recorded, and managed to prevent loss. Dockworkers were central to this flow, ensuring that goods reached their destinations intact, on time, and in the correct quantities. Their work required both skill and endurance. Loading and unloading barges involved balancing heavy loads, often under hazardous conditions. Wooden docks could become slippery after rain, and riverbanks were uneven and treacherous. Strong currents and sudden floods added constant risk. Yet the laborers adapted, learning techniques to stabilize cargo, distribute weight, and navigate unpredictable water levels. This practical expertise, though invisible in records, was critical to the functioning of the empire. Coordination was another essential skill. Oversight came from port administrators, who organized schedules, assigned tasks, and monitored productivity. Laborers, however, had to interpret these orders and execute them precisely. Miscommunication could result in capsized barges, lost grain, or delayed military supplies. The laborers' ability to work as a cohesive unit under pressure ensured that imperial directives were carried out efficiently, even in the face of natural hazards and human error. Dockworkers were also integral to the Han military. During campaigns against the Xiongnu or rebellions in distant provinces, armies depended on rivers and canals for rapid resupply. Food, weapons, and equipment moved along these waterways, carried, lifted, and organized by laborers. A single mismanaged shipment could delay troops for days, with potentially disastrous consequences. In effect, these laborers were the invisible quartermasters of the empire, enabling the military to function at a scale that would otherwise have been impossible. Economically, their work connected regions. Rivers were the primary arteries for long-distance trade within the empire. Dockworkers ensured that local produce reached city markets, that craftsmen received raw materials, and that taxes in kind could be transferred to the imperial treasury. Without their labor, trade would have been slow, unreliable, and prone to loss or spoilage. The stability of urban centers depended on the competence and persistence of these unheralded workers. Skill and experience were crucial. Each dockworker had an intimate understanding of the river, currents, tides, seasonal water levels, and flood patterns. They knew how to handle cargo during storms or high water and how to arrange loads to prevent accidents. This knowledge was passed orally and through hands-on apprenticeship, forming an unrecorded system of practical expertise that sustained the empire's supply chains for centuries. Despite their importance, dockworkers remained invisible in historical records. Official annals celebrated emperors, generals, and merchants, rarely acknowledging the thousands of hands that enabled the empire to function. Their labor was repetitive, physically demanding, and largely anonymous, yet it was indispensable. The prosperity of the Han dynasty, its cities, military campaigns, and internal cohesion was built on these quiet, tireless efforts. Moreover, the work carried personal risks. Accidents were common: drowning in rivers, injuries from heavy cargo, and exposure to harsh weather. Laborers often worked under conscription or local obligation, with minimal compensation or recognition. Their daily lives were a balance of survival and service, and their success was measured by the absence of disaster rather than the presence of reward. Yet in this anonymity lies a remarkable truth. The Han dynasty's ability to govern a vast, diverse empire was directly tied to the labor of these dockworkers. Their knowledge, endurance, and coordination allowed grain to feed cities, weapons to reach armies, and trade to flourish. The empire's prosperity, military capacity, and administrative efficiency were inseparable from the invisible work of those who moved goods along rivers and docks. As you consider their role, a deeper question emerges. If the stability and success of one of China's greatest dynasties depended on the labor of unseen, uncelebrated dockworkers, how many other great empires owe their survival to invisible hands whose stories are lost to time? And how fragile might these systems have been if even a small fraction of this labor had failed? By the end of the Han dynasty, the river networks and docks that connected the empire were among its greatest achievements. Yet the glory of these accomplishments rarely reached the men and women whose labor made it possible. The docks themselves, simple wooden platforms and riverbanks carefully leveled, reinforced, and maintained, were silent witnesses to the countless hours of toil, the backbreaking lifting of grain sacks, the careful balancing of heavy cargo, and the coordination required to keep the empire supplied. Without these workers, the political and economic structures celebrated by history would have faltered. The Han Empire stretched over thousands of kilometers, encompassing mountains, plains, deserts, and river valleys. Its administration depended on the timely movement of goods and messages. Dockworkers ensured that provisions from fertile regions reached cities, military garrisons, and imperial storehouses. Grain, the lifeblood of the population, could not have reached Chang'an, Luoyang, or regional strongholds without these laborers. During military campaigns, soldiers relied on timely resupply of food, weapons, and equipment, all facilitated by the hidden diligence of dockworkers. The scale of their impact is staggering. Grain transported along rivers sustained armies that fought on multiple fronts. Luxury goods, silk, jade, ceramics moved along docks to satisfy elite demand and fuel economic stability. Salt and metal ores were distributed to ensure both basic survival and industrial capacity. Every shipment required careful handling, precise coordination, and intimate knowledge of river conditions. The empire's capacity to operate as a coherent whole was inseparable from their labor. Yet the dockworkers' work was often perilous. River currents could sweep away barges and men alike. Seasonal flooding could destroy entire docks, requiring rapid reconstruction. Heavy cargo led to frequent injuries. Laborers worked long hours in harsh conditions, often without recognition or reward. Despite these hardships, their labor was the invisible mechanism that allowed an empire to function smoothly. The continuity of supply lines was the quiet triumph of ordinary hands, uncelebrated yet essential. Their labor also fostered social cohesion and connection between distant regions. Dockworkers enabled trade between cities, villages, and provinces, linking the economy and integrating diverse territories. They connected rural producers with urban consumers, military garrisons with administrative centers, and imperial decrees with the resources necessary to enforce them. In doing so, they became the human threads weaving the empire together. Remarkably, much of the practical knowledge these laborers held was unrecorded. They understood river dynamics, seasonal changes, cargo distribution, and teamwork techniques through experience and apprenticeship rather than manuals or charts. This knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, was critical for the empire's survival. Without it, mistakes could mean starvation, economic disruption, or military failure. Yet because it was invisible and unrecorded, it almost never appears in historical accounts. Even after the fall of the Han Dynasty, the infrastructure and practices established by these dockworkers influenced later Chinese dynasties. Canals and river transport continued to form the backbone of logistics for centuries. Roads, grain shipment systems, and administrative supply chains built on river transport all relied on the foundational labor, knowledge, and expertise of these early hand dockworkers. Their legacy is structural and enduring, shaping civilization long after their names vanished. Reflecting on their work, one sees the larger truth about human achievement. History often remembers emperors, generals, and famous innovators, but the survival and success of societies frequently rests on invisible labor. Dockworkers in the Han Dynasty were not celebrated, but without them, the empire could not have fed its people, supplied its armies, or maintained stability. Their skill, endurance, and diligence were central to the functioning of one of the world's most influential civilizations. In the end, their story is a reminder of the hidden layers that sustain human progress. While empires may rise and fall, and rulers may claim glory, the quiet, persistent work of ordinary people lifting, moving, coordinating, and preserving ensures continuity, survival, and stability. They are the unsung engineers of civilization itself. The legacy of the Han dockworkers demonstrates that monumental achievements depend as much on the labor of the unrecognized as on the ambition of the celebrated. As this story concludes, a reflective question emerges. If the flow of empire relies on the invisible labor of dockworkers, scribes, and other unsung workers, how might our understanding of history and the people who shape it change if we shifted our attention from the famous to the forgotten? And what lessons could modern societies learn about the power of quiet, disciplined labor that sustains civilization from behind the scenes?